On today's docket, the governor of New Mexico issuing an emergency order to suspend the right to carry firearms in public across Albuquerque and the surrounding county. It's in place for at least 30 days. This is in response to a recent surge of gun violence. And now the National Association for Gun Rights has filed a lawsuit against the state's governor, arguing the order violates the Second Amendment.
So we're taking this case up for National Report Court today with Erin Elmore. She's an attorney and Republican strategist. Thane Rosenbaum is a distinguished professor at Touro University. So, if you don't mind, for the purposes of today's segment, Erin, you will represent the National Association for Gun Rights. Thane, if you don't mind, professor representing the New Mexico governor. Erin, let me start with you. In the lawsuit, the National Association for Gun Rights arguing this, quote, the state must justify the carry prohibition by demonstrating that it is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, but it is impossible for the state to meet this burden because there is no such historical tradition of firearm regulation in this nation. Erin, the arguments here.
So there's no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the Constitution. And the language you just had up on the screen, that's directly from the leading precedent from the Supreme Court. The case is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And this expanded Second Amendment rights in this country more than we've seen in like a decade. So Judge Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion, and there he said exactly what you saw on the screen. Firearm regulations must be consistent with the nation's historic tradition. So that's why they used that language, because it was consistent with the precedent. So as we know, the Second Amendment says we have the right to bear arms and that shall not be infringed. And we see a clear infringement here. This is a pretty black and white case. You know, we need to prosecute criminals. That's the public policy argument. And this is an executive order, not a legislative action, which makes it even worse. It's not like the people that were elected in New Mexico by the people made this. This was an executive order by Michelle Grisham, and it's very dangerous, and it will be absolutely overturned. And I know that they are seeking an injunction, which means immediate relief, and they are entitled to such an injunction.
You know, it's not just Republicans who've taken issue with this. Even some Democratic lawmakers have spoken out, and some reporters also really questioning the governor's authority. Here is the governor again on what she describes as a public health emergency. Watch.
If there's an emergency, and I've declared an emergency for a temporary amount of time, I can invoke additional powers. No constitutional right, in my view, including my oath, is intended to be absolute. There are restrictions on free speech. There are restrictions on my freedoms.
If someone's got a concealed carry permit in Albuquerque walking down a public street, they're not going to get arrested.
I can make the point that they should be.
Okay, again, for the purposes of National Report Court, Thane Rosenbaum, what is the defense here?
So, Emma, this isn't black and white at all. It's pretty straightforward. She is the governor of a state that has a public health emergency. Children are being killed. It is a suspension of the law. It's not outlawing guns. It simply says you can't take guns into the public sphere in a specific area of the state where there's a high concentration of people, and that's where children are most at risk. The Supreme Court decision that we're citing, the Bruin case, specifically says that there are sensitive places where gun restrictions are permissible, and it listed public parks and schools as if to suggest that if children are involved, we make special provisions for that. The governor always has police powers, emergency powers, that oftentimes conflict with federal law, and the courts accept it. And lastly, there is a historical tradition. Anyone that's watched movies like Tombstone or Wyatt Earp know that all throughout the Southwest, there were sheriffs and U.S. Marshals that said, we're not going to let you carry a gun in town because we don't want you being in town with guns.
All right.
So it's not as if there isn't a historical tradition. There was.
Okay, we got to keep this one short just because we had that breaking news with Speaker McCarthy. So we wanted to welcome in Doug Burns, who's been listening to both arguments. And I know you both could expand even more, so making great cases. But Doug, what you've heard so far from these attorneys, where you land on this case?
Well, Thane argued a tough position very, very well, and that's what good lawyers do. But at the end of the day, it's a basic premise of constitutional law, as the professor well knows. We look to see whether the the government can take less intrusive action to achieve the result they're looking for. So here, this is not a logical action to suspend gun rights, and I would have to rule accordingly.
Okay. We're also going to keep this conversation going with Austin Hines, the Director of Political Operations with the National Association for Gun Rights. He's going to join National Report on Thursday. So this conversation isn't going anywhere, but we are thanks to Aaron and Thane and, of course, Doug. National Report Court is adjourned today. All right, coming up, should President Biden take the debates?